Of her own grandfather, she had 4 children. This is the Caldwell family's dark and disturbing history, inhabitants of the deep Missouri mountains, where for generations, geographical and social isolation has paved the way for practices that defy not only the laws of society, but those of human nature itself. In the early 1950s, while the rest of America thrived in the post-war period, there remained communities practically untouched by progress among the dense forests and hidden valleys of the Missouri mountains. Away from the main roads and virtually invisible to the outside world, the Caldwell family lived on a 40-acre property. The first news about the Caldwells arrived to the authorities in 1957, when a lost hunter happened upon the property and witnessed something that deeply disturbed him. Children with visible physical characteristics of genetic degeneration, working alongside adults whose countenance suggested too close a kinship. With an iron hand, the family patriarch Harold Caldwell, born in 1897, ruled the small clan. A widower since 1943 when his wife Mabel passed away during the delivery of their third daughter, Harold moved even further from civilization, creating his own rules and establishing a kind of isolated microculture where his word was absolute law. What happens in the mountains, stays in the mountains. This was the unofficial motto of the isolated families in this region. And for the Caldwells, it became a justification for behaviors that would be considered unthinkable anywhere else. Harold's granddaughter was Martha Caldwell, born in 1938. When Martha was only 8 years old, her mother, Eliza, had died, leaving her in her grandfather's care. The limits of human understanding would be overcome by what the authorities discovered years later. From the age of 13, a forbidden relationship was established between Martha and her own grandfather, resulting in the birth of 4 children between 1952 and 1957. A pattern of consanguineous unions dating back to previous generations in the Caldwell family was revealed by preliminary investigations. Isolation was not only geographical, but ideological. Harold, whose own parents were first-degree cousins, had grown up with the distorted notion that maintaining pure blood was a tradition to be preserved. The situation was described as the most extreme example of human degradation from prolonged consanguinity he had ever witnessed in his 30 years of medical practice by Dr. William Reynolds, a rural doctor who first documented the case for the authorities in 1958. Clear signs of genetic problems were shown by the children: reduced stature, atypical facial characteristics, obvious cognitive difficulties, and in 2 cases, congenital heart malformations. Dr. Reynolds told his confidential report to the Missouri Department of Social Services. Within that microcosm, the normalization of this reality was the most disturbing thing. When the authorities intervened, Martha, then 20, showed clear signs of psychological conditioning and did not fully understand her situation was not normal. For her, that was the only reality she had ever known. A family complex was formed by the Caldwell property, with its main wooden dwelling and small attached buildings, where approximately 17 people all related by close blood ties lived. So deep was the isolation that some of the youngest children could barely articulate words, developing their own form of communication almost incomprehensible to outsiders. Check now if you are already subscribed to this channel. The stories we reveal are fundamental historical documents that remain deliberately hidden from official books. Only our subscribers have access to these forbidden truths that shape our society to this day. With Harold and his granddaughter Martha, the history of consanguinity in the Caldwell family did not start. A pattern dating back to the late 19th century was revealed by historical documents recovered by social researchers, when the first Caldwells settled in the Ozark Mountains. In 1878, Josiah Caldwell, Harold's grandfather, had arrived in the region, fleeing accusations in North Carolina. The records indicated that Josiah had already been investigated for improper family practices in his homeland, although the euphemistic language of the time made the exact nature of the accusations difficult to determine. The perfect isolation to establish his own kingdom was found by Josiah in the Missouri mountains. He married his second-degree cousin, Abigail, and together they had 8 children, 3 of whom did not survive beyond their first years due to undiagnosed congenital complications. A pattern of deep distrust of the outside world was established by this first generation of Caldwells in Missouri. They educated their children without contact with formal schools, developed their own system of folk medicine, and rejected any external interference, even when offered as aid. A kind of ideological protective shield is developed by these isolated families, explained Dr. Elena Simmons, an anthropologist who studied isolated communities in the Appalachians and Ozarks during the 1960s. To them, the outside world represents a threat to their existence, and any external practice is seen as corrupt or dangerous. This isolation was deepened by the next generation of Caldwells. His own first cousin, Susan, was married by Ernest Caldwell, son of Josiah and father of Harold. Including Harold, 5 children were produced by this union, held without any official record in 1895. That all of Ernest and Susan's sons had distinctive characteristics of consanguinity, including short stature, severe dental problems, and a tendency to chronic respiratory diseases, was indicated by fragmentary medical records recovered from a traveling doctor who visited the region in 1910. In this environment where endogamy was normalized and even encouraged, Harold, born in 1897, grew up. A young woman from an equally isolated neighboring family, Mabel Jenkins, was married by him in 1920. What was not documented at the time, but discovered during the 1958 investigations, was that Mabel was actually his second-degree cousin on the maternal side. 3 children were produced by the union of Harold and Mabel: Daniel, 1923, Eliza, 1927, and Ruth, 1943. During Ruth's delivery, Mabel passed away, leaving Harold to raise his 3 children alone, which further intensified his isolation and distrust of the outside world. Martha's mother, Eliza, was briefly married to James Turner, an outsider who worked on road construction in the region. This was one of the few moments when new blood entered the Caldwell lineage. However, when Eliza discovered she was pregnant, James abandoned her, and she returned to the family property with her newborn daughter, Martha. When Eliza died in 1946, a victim of untreated pneumonia, Martha was placed entirely under the care of her grandfather, Harold. That it was during this time that Harold began to psychologically prepare his granddaughter for the role he intended for her is suggested by testimonials collected in 1958. A classic case of conditioning and isolation, explained Dr. Lawrence Hoffman, a forensic psychiatrist consulted during the investigations. The child gradually accepts the distorted reality presented to him as the only and natural one, with no external references for normality. The perfect victim for Harold's psychological control became Martha, growing up without contact with other children outside the family circle, without formal education, and without exposure to conventional social values. The forbidden relationship was established when she was 13, in 1951, resulting in the birth of their first child, Adam, the following year. 4 children were given birth to by Martha between 1952 and 1957, Adam, Sarah, Joseph, and Rebecca. Clear signs of genetic problems resulting from extreme consanguinity were had by all. A cardiac malformation that required medical care was what Adam was born with, but Harold refused to seek help, resulting in the boy's death at age 3. The official cause of death was recorded as fever, but later investigations suggested it was untreated complications of his congenital heart condition, indicate the records. In November 1957, the fate of the Caldwell family moved irrevocably when hunter Frank Weber got lost during a storm in the Ozark Mountains. Seeking shelter, he accidentally found the Caldwell property and witnessed scenes that deeply disturbed him. "I saw children who didn't seem normal," Weber told authorities in Jefferson City. "There was something wrong with their faces, the way they moved, and the way that old man looked at the young girl. It wasn't a grandfather's gaze toward a granddaughter." What he saw disturbed Weber, who was not well received by the family. Under the sight of a shotgun, Harold Caldwell expelled him from the property. Upon returning to civilization, Weber reported his observations to local Sheriff John Pritchard, who initially proved skeptical. "We have many isolated families in these mountains, Frank," said the sheriff. "They are different, yes, but we cannot interfere just because they live in their own way." However, when Weber mentioned the children's apparent conditions and the young age of their mother, the sheriff was obliged to investigate. In January 1958, accompanied by Dr. William Reynolds and 2 deputies, Pritchard visited the Caldwell property. What they found confirmed and surpassed the initial suspicions. 3 living children were had by Martha, then 20, Sarah, Joseph, and Rebecca, and she was pregnant again. Evident signs of genetic problems were presented by all three. At 4, Sarah could barely speak. With 3 years, Joseph had a visibly small head. And with only 1 year, Rebecca had distorted facial characteristics. I was disgusted by what I saw, but even more so by Harold's attitude, Sheriff Pritchard later reported. He showed no sign of shame or remorse. On the contrary, he seemed to consider it his natural right. The initial intervention was complicated by the geographical isolation and Harold's violent resistance. When the authorities tried to remove Martha and the children, he reacted with a shotgun, resulting in a tense impasse that lasted several hours. It was Martha who surprisingly disarmed the situation. In a moment of clarity, possibly motivated by worry for her children, she agreed to accompany the authorities so that Rebecca, who had a high fever, could receive medical care. A window to the outside world that would never close again for the Caldwells was opened by this momentary decision. To Jefferson City, Martha and her children were taken, where they received medical attention and underwent psychological and social assessments. If you are watching this story, leave in the comments "Blood Speaks" so I know you are following these historical revelations that have been deliberately hidden from official history. The worst suspicions were confirmed by the initial medical examinations. The children have multiple signs of prolonged consanguinity, congenital heart problems, severely compromised cognitive development, facial and cranial malformations, short stature for their age, and weakened immune systems, Dr. Reynolds documented. Although less pronounced, Martha herself, the product of previous generations of consanguinity, has similar signs. The discovery through blood tests available at the time that the children had extremely high homozygosity, a technical term indicating a severe lack of genetic diversity, was the most shocking. Although advanced genetic tests weren't available in 1958, the methods of the time were enough to confirm that Harold was both the grandfather and the father of the children. While Martha and her children remained under care in Jefferson City, the authorities returned to the Caldwell property for further investigation. The true extent of the situation was revealed by what they found. Harold's personal diaries, which coldly documented his intentions to purify the Caldwell lineage. Birth and previous death records that had never been officially declared. And evidence that other consanguineous relationships had occurred within the extended family. Daniel, Harold's eldest son, had a similar relationship with his own daughter, Mary, resulting in 2 children with severe developmental problems. Ruth, Harold's youngest daughter, had a son whose father was unclear, but his own brother, Daniel, was suspected. The attention of experts in genetics, psychology, and social work from across the state of Missouri was attracted by the magnitude of the case. To evaluate Martha psychologically, Dr. Lawrence Hoffman, a forensic psychiatrist at the University of Missouri, was called. The case of Martha Caldwell represents one of the most extreme examples of psychological manipulation and social isolation I have ever documented, Dr. Hoffman wrote in his confidential report. She was created in an environment where the normal limits of family relationships were completely distorted, where she had no access to any external reference of normality. The depth of the psychological conditioning to which she had been subjected was revealed by the initial interviews with Martha. That her relationship with her grandfather was abnormal or prohibited was something she showed little understanding of. For her, that was simply the life she knew, the reality presented to her as natural. Grandpa always said our blood was special, Martha reported during one evaluation session. He said outsiders wanted to dilute it, weaken it. It was our responsibility to keep it pure. While the Caldwell case progressed through the Missouri judicial system in 1958, the physical and cognitive effects of extreme consanguinity presented by Martha's children were meticulously documented by the doctors and geneticists involved. To examine the children and produce a report on their condition, Dr. James Harrison, a geneticist at Washington University in St. Louis, was invited. A fundamental case study on the effects of prolonged consanguinity became his work, later published in medical magazines with names altered to protect identities. The accumulated result of multiple generations of consanguineous unions is what we observe in the Caldwell family, wrote Dr. Harrison. Not only are Martha's children the product of a union between grandfather and granddaughter, but they carry in their genetic code the impact of at least 4 previous generations of marriages between close relatives. What doctors of the time called accumulated recessive features were presented by Sarah, Martha's 4-year-old eldest daughter. Her cognitive capacity was severely compromised, her physical growth was delayed, and she suffered from frequent seizures. Less than 10 understandable words was what her vocabulary was limited to at age 4. Microcephaly, a condition where the head and brain are significantly smaller than normal, was what Joseph, the 3-year-old son, had. This resulted in severe developmental delays and neurological problems that doctors anticipated would prevent him from developing basic self-care skills. A congenital heart malformation similar to the one that had killed her older brother Adam was what Rebecca, the youngest at just 1 year, suffered from. To save her life, immediate medical intervention was necessary, something that would have been impossible had she remained isolated in the mountains. In April 1958, at Jefferson City State Hospital, Martha's 4th child, still in pregnancy when she was removed from the Caldwells, was born. The boy, temporarily designated as Baby Caldwell in medical records, had multiple complications, including a cleft palate, clenched fingers, syndactyly, and a complex heart malformation. Despite the medical team's efforts, the baby died 3 days after birth. Multiple internal defects that would have been incompatible with long-term life, even with medical intervention, were revealed by the autopsy. The observable genetic patterns in the children were carefully documented by Dr. Harrison. The devastating expression of deleterious recessive genes that in populations with normal genetic diversity would remain dormant is what we are witnessing. The extreme homozygosity in the Caldwell children means they inherited identical copies of harmful mutations from both mother and father-grandfather, eliminating the protective effect that genetic diversity usually provides. In simpler terms, every person carries some potentially harmful mutations in their genetic code. Normally, these mutations remain harmless because we receive a healthy second copy of the gene from the other parent. However, when parents are close relatives, the probability of both carrying the same mutation increases dramatically, resulting in children who receive 2 copies of the harmful gene. Although to a less extreme degree, Martha herself, the product of earlier generations of consanguinity, also had physical signs of the practice: short stature, severe dental problems, and slight cognitive difficulties. However, due to the direct relationship with her grandfather, the effects on her children were exponentially more severe. That the Caldwell children had a significantly compromised immune system was also documented by the medical team. Common childhood infections like colds and ear infections quickly became dangerous to them, requiring frequent medical intervention. It's as if their bodies are fighting a constant battle against their own compromised genetic code, Dr. Reynolds noted. So much of their vital energy is committed to correcting internal defects that little is left to combat external threats. In addition to the physical problems, the emotional and behavioral effects on the children were documented by the psychologists involved in the case. Highly abnormal behavioral patterns were demonstrated by Sarah, the oldest and most verbally capable. She alternated between periods of deep apathy and explosions of self-directed aggressiveness. Stereotyped, repetitive movements were shown by Joseph, and he seemed unable to form emotional connections with his caregivers. Significant delays in normal social development milestones, such as eye contact and response to her name, were shown by Rebecca, still very young. In addition to the cognitive deficits resulting from genetic anomalies, these children suffered severe sensory and social deprivation during their formative years, noted Dr. Caroline Meyer, a child psychologist assigned to work with the children, in her report. They were raised in an environment where normal development was impossible, without appropriate stimuli, without appropriate social interaction, without exposure to the world beyond the isolated Caldwell property. A fundamental study on the effects of prolonged consanguinity quickly became the Caldwell case, quoted in medical textbooks and used in training programs for social workers, doctors, and psychologists for decades after its discovery. Away from the eyes of the public and the press, Harold Caldwell's trial took place in September 1958. Aware of the extraordinarily disturbing nature of the case, Missouri authorities maintained the proceedings in confidentiality to protect the victim's privacy and avoid turning the situation into a sensational spectacle. Harold, then 61, was found guilty on multiple charges, including forbidden relationships, child neglect, and abuse. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, effectively a life sentence given his age. Throughout the process, he refused to demonstrate remorse, maintaining his distorted belief in Caldwell blood purification. "I didn't expect people from the outside to understand," were his only words during sentencing. "What we did was for the good of the family." In 1967, at the age of 70, Harold died at the Missouri State Penitentiary without ever recognizing the evil he had caused. His body was unclaimed by any family member and was buried in the prison cemetery under a simple tombstone marked only with his prisoner number. A more complex and nuanced path was followed by the fate of Martha and her children. Evaluated as a victim and not a perpetrator, Martha was sent to a specialized psychological and social rehabilitation program in Kansas City, far from the Ozark Mountains and the memories they held. "Martha's case represents a unique rehabilitation challenge," wrote Dr. Elizabeth Parker, responsible for her treatment. "She needs not only to process the trauma of what she has lived through, but to essentially relearn what family, relationships, and identity mean." The process was slow and painful. Initially confused and resistant, Martha gradually began to understand the abnormality of her previous situation through exposure to healthy social environments and receiving a basic education. The first breakthroughs were particularly difficult. A deep emotional crisis requiring temporary hospitalization was caused by the moment she realized that what her grandfather had done was universally considered wrong and harmful. She described feeling like the floor had disappeared from under her feet, reported Dr. Parker. Her entire understanding of the world and her identity had been fundamentally shaken. Specialized adoptive homes capable of dealing with their complex medical and developmental needs were where Martha's children were initially placed. With the most severe problems, Sarah and Joseph were eventually transferred to long-term care institutions where they could receive the constant medical attention their conditions demanded. The youngest and least affected, Rebecca, was adopted by a family of doctors in St. Louis who had experience with children with special needs. Although her heart condition required multiple surgeries throughout her childhood, she was able to develop a level of functionality that surprised many of the experts involved in her initial case. In 1962, after 4 years of intensive treatment, Martha had progressed enough to be considered capable of living semi-independently. Under a new identity to protect her from stigma, she was helped to settle in a small town in northern Missouri, where she worked as an assistant in a local library. She completed her basic education and eventually obtained a high school equivalency diploma. Supervised visits with Rebecca, the only one of her children capable of understanding the concept of a mother, were allowed by the authorities. Initially tense and emotionally charged, these meetings gradually evolved into a cautious but genuine relationship. Martha never returned to the Ozark Mountains. The Caldwell property was confiscated by the state and later sold. The main house was demolished, and new owners, unaware of the site's history, established a cattle farm in the area. The other extended Caldwell family members, Martha's cousins and half-siblings, were located by authorities and received varying degrees of intervention depending on their involvement and condition. A sentence similar to his father's was received by Daniel Caldwell, Harold's son and father of 2 children with his own daughter. Similar treatment to Martha's was received by his daughter, Mary, and her children. Although kept out of the media spotlight at the time, the Caldwell case had a profound impact on social work and child protection policies in Missouri, and eventually across the country, leading to the creation of specific protocols to identify and intervene in isolated communities where similar practices might occur. The rest of his career was dedicated by William Reynolds, the rural doctor who first documented the case, to educating medical professionals about the signs of consanguinity and family abuse. The publication in 1965 of the Manual for Identification and Intervention in Isolated Communities, which became a key resource for social workers in rural regions, resulted from his pioneering work. In 1970, Martha, then 32 and using her new name, Mary Wilson, had built a modest but stable life. She was still in therapy and had developed some significant social relationships. Although she never married or had more children, according to the monitoring reports from the social worker assigned to her case, she had found a delicate balance between acknowledging her past and building a future. In 1975, her youngest daughter, Rebecca, with whom she maintained contact, graduated from high school, an extraordinary achievement considering her physical limitations and the doctor's initial prognosis. Although she was never able to live completely independently due to ongoing heart complications, she worked as a volunteer in a children's hospital, using her own experience to comfort children with complex medical conditions. If you have watched this far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying I watched here so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Be sure to leave your like on this video and share it with someone you believe would also be interested in these historical revelations. If you are not yet subscribed, this is the perfect time to become part of this community that seeks to unravel the darkest secrets in American history. Institutionalized for the rest of their lives remained Sarah and Joseph, the most severely affected children. In 1978, at the age of 24, Sarah passed away from respiratory complications. Joseph lived until 1985, dying at 30, a surprising longevity considering the severity of his condition. A letter written by Rebecca to the Missouri Department of Social Services in 1982, requesting access to the original records to better understand her family history, was the last official registry related to the Caldwell case. "I don't seek these records out of resentment or anger," she wrote. "I seek them to understand who I am and where I came from. I believe that knowing our story, however painful, is the only way to truly overcome it." A dark reminder of the consequences of prolonged consanguinity remains the history of the Caldwells, not only the genetic and physical consequences, but also the human cost in terms of suffering, lost identity, and lives that never had a chance to reach their full potential. In a final note of her follow-up assessment in 1980, Dr. Parker wrote about Martha, "The real miracle in Martha's case is not that she survived the horror of her initial situation, but that she has found, despite everything, the ability to build something like a normal life. There is a resilience in the human spirit that even transcends the most fundamental violations of our nature." Now unrecognizable is the Caldwell property in the Ozark Mountains, covered by new forests and with no visible traces of what happened there. However, through generations, the genetic and psychological legacy of what happened in that isolated valley continues to reverberate. A silent reminder that some secrets, once discovered, can never be truly buried.